In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Honourable members, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is the Honourable Fahetma Nahami Matahapa, the Prime Minister of the Independent State of Samoa, and Her Excellency the High Commissioner for Samoa. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you both. And I call the Prime Minister on indulgence.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And it is indeed a great honour to welcome Prime Minister Firme of Samoa to Parliament today. Australia and Samoa are long-standing friends. There are 100,000 people of Samoan descent call Australia home, including some of our best rugby league players, I've got to say. And I congratulated the Prime Minister on making the World Cup final quite an extraordinary achievement for a nation of that size to do that at the end of last year. Today we signed a bilateral partnership agreement. This elevates our partnership of equals, and I look forward to further enhancing our bilateral and regional cooperation. I want to recognise today and appreciate the influential role that Prime Minister Firme has played in ensuring the unity of the Pacific Islands Forum. Finally, I commend the Prime Minister's leadership on climate action. You are a most welcome visitor to Australia.
And on indulgence, I call the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to join with the Prime Minister in his fine words of welcome to Prime Minister Firme. Thank you, Prime Minister, for being here with us. You're a trusted and dear friend. I had the great opportunity of meeting with the Prime Minister this morning to talk about areas of mutual interest, in particular labour mobility and the way in which we can provide support to Samoa and make sure that there's not the brain drain, that there is the ability for skills to come home, as well as remittances and support financially for the country to continue to develop. As the Prime Minister pointed out, there are many areas of endeavour. The work of the Prime Minister over a long period of time, first elected in 1985, I think was the year. I don't know that she wants me to mention that year, but it shows a depth of experience, a Deputy Prime Minister in the former government and Prime Minister in this government. It is a remarkable feat, and her leadership, particularly in the PIF, as the Prime Minister points out, is absolutely crucial, and she's stepping up as a true leader in the Pacific at exactly the right time, and we welcome her here today. As was pointed out before, at the time of the World Cup, as you were driving around in capital cities, there were flags, there were flags at the side of cars. Now, you beat England, not Australia, so I'm sorry to raise that last point, but it is a very passionate, family-focused population of 100,000 here in Australia, contribute wonderfully to our country, and we talked about the celebration of culture in our schools and elsewhere across communities. So, Prime Minister, I welcome you most warmly to our country, and I thank you so much for being a good friend of our country.
Questions without notice. I'll give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In his first speech to Parliament following the election, the Prime Minister promised to, and I quote, "fulfil our promises and to prove worthy of the trust of the Australian people." It was on the 27th of February 2022. Why won't the Prime Minister reaffirm his solemn election promise to cut power prices by $275 every year? And if the war in Ukraine is his excuse, why did he continue to make his promise 28 times after Russia had gone into Ukraine? Why is this Prime Minister so out of touch?
Order.
And why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
The member for Wannon will withdraw that comment.
I withdraw.
I'll give the call to the Prime Minister. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I say to the member for Warren he might need to explain that one to me. In terms of...
Order!
In terms of inflation,
Order. Member for Barker will cease clapping. Order. Members on my left.
I'm asked about small things, Mr. Speaker. Small things, as they say. Small things.
The Leader of the Opposition.
The fact is that those opposite like to talk about the cost of living and energy prices as if nothing happened on their watch. But the truth is that inflation, which is feeding into higher prices, had occurred before the change of government. Indeed, inflation had taken off before Labor took office. The CPI jumped 2.1% in the March 2022 quarter, the highest increase, the largest quarterly rise in this century, occurred on their watch. And what they also know is that energy prices were going up because the default market offer had already been handed to the government, and they chose to keep it secret. They not only chose to keep it secret, they chose to introduce a special regulation to keep it secret before the election. So they are the circumstances which we inherited when we came to office. Since then, what we've been doing is taking action to lower prices. The action that we've taken, such as the Energy Price Relief Plan of $1.5 billion, those opposite voted against.
Order. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. What are the benefits for Australian business and the Australian economy from successfully managing the energy transition, and what are the impediments?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the wonderful member for Macquarie for her question as well. Successfully managing the energy transition is central to Australia's future prosperity, and that makes it absolutely central to our economic plan as well. As the Productivity Commission identified in its report last week, climate change is and will be an increasing cost felt by our communities and our economy and our country as well. But the shift to net zero should also be seen as an opportunity to create new jobs and new industries and new sources of growth as well, so that what has been a headwind in our economy can be a tailwind in our economy and for our future prosperity as well, if we get it right. Now, the business community in this country understands this opportunity, even if the so-called party of business doesn't. Deloitte estimates that a smooth transition to net zero by 2050 could add an extra $890 billion to GDP over the next 50 years, increase productivity and create an extra 195,000 jobs. The BCA says that low emissions technologies could deliver $30 billion a year of new export revenue from energy-intensive low emissions products by 2040. A recent study from ClimateWorks estimated that the move towards net zero will require something like $225 billion of additional investment by 2050. So it's absolutely critical, Mr. Speaker, that our policy settings allow this investment to be delivered in the most efficient way. Now, Australian businesses and investors see the potential of harnessing demand for renewable energy to broaden and deepen our industrial base, while at the same time maximising our traditional economic strengths. But they need certainty in order to do that, Mr. Speaker. And that's why the business community and Australia's big employers and investors are pleading with this parliament to support the passage of the safeguards legislation. And it's why it's incumbent on everyone in this parliament to get behind it. Mr. Speaker, Australians and their economy can't afford another decade of this parliament stumbling and stuffing around when it comes to climate change and energy policy. On this side of the House, we want to get on with the job of providing business with the certainty they need in the interests of our economy, our environment, our country, our people and their future, while this coalition of cookers continues to stand in the way.
Order. When the House comes to order, and there'll be silence so I can hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Beyond Blue have reported more people seeking help due to the cost of living crisis, with people lurching from one challenge to the next. When asked on Monday whether he could identify a single Australian paying less on their power bills, grocery bills or interest rate, the Prime Minister arrogantly asserted, "It's been a pretty good 10 months. Why is the Prime Minister so out of touch, and why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Members on my left and my right, Prime Minister will be heard in silence, and that's the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. When you remove the hyperbole from that question, it goes to people's mental health issues and it goes to the issues relating to people's standard of living and the pressure that can be placed on them. And that is something that I take very seriously and something that I have given.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition has asked her question. I demanded that she be heard in silence. I think the Prime Minister can have the same respect. I'll give him the call.
And something that I'm on the record for, saying that one of the things that the former government got right was the increased investment in mental health issues, something that I have said.
Member for Lindsay. Member for Lindsay and the member for Casey.
Seriously, a controversial issue. No, it was your decision that you put the time frame on it. But one of the things that I'm drawn attention to is the impact of people who've given evidence before the Robodebt Royal Commission about the impact on their mental health of issues which took away, not just took away the money that they had, but issued them with massive debts and the pressure that was placed on them. Here's what Felicity de Somerville said. "I would rather live in my car and be broke and poor than ever use Centrelink again." This is what Anne Julie said. "When I got my Robodebt, I was pregnant and living in a refuge in Canberra after escaping domestic violence. I was working 3 jobs to stay afloat."
Order. The Minister for Skills. Prime Minister will pause. The Manager of Opposition on point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, the Prime Minister was asked about cost of living, power bills, grocery bills, interest
Members
rates.
on my right will cease interjecting immediately, and the Manager will start his point again.
On relevance, the Prime Minister was asked about cost of living, was asked about power bills, grocery bills, interest rate, and the implications of all of this for mental health, and he's pivoted onto a completely different topic.
The Prime Minister was asked in the first part of the question regarding a specific charity and mental health. He is talking about those issues, and I'll bring him back to the question. If he strays too far, I'll give him the call.
Mr Speaker, I was asked about cost of living and the impact on people's mental health. This is evidence that's been given this year about real people and the real impact of what occurred.
The member for Deakin.
When I got my Robodebt, I was pregnant and living in a refuge in Canberra and escaping domestic violence. I was working 3 jobs to stay afloat. Because of this debt, I was unable to afford medication and was hospitalised. Axel said this: "I was worried about how I would eat and whether I could stay in my home. The previous government kicked me in the guts. We need this Royal Commission so we know who did this to us."
The member for Green.
Catherine, the previous government needs to be held to be accountable because it's immoral for them to impose these debts and then not explain how the debts came to be. Mr Speaker, not only did the Robodebt scandal impose those sort of conditions on vulnerable people in attacking not just the standard of living but whether they had any money at all to survive, we know that the former member for Aston had this to say: "We'll find you, we'll track you down and you will have to repay those debts and you may end up in prison." What impact do you think
Members
that
on my
had
right.
on people's mental health?
The member for Patterson. The Minister for Early Childhood will cease interjecting immediately. There is far too much noise. I can barely hear an answer. If this continues, a general warning will be issued for the entire House. Give the call to the member for Fraser.
My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Why are the government's safeguard mechanism reforms so critical? What will be the consequences if the changes do not pass?
The call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and thank him for his very substantial policy contribution in this House. Now, Mr Speaker, our country is on the cusp of a transformation. On the cusp of a transformation to be a sophisticated industrial powerhouse built on renewable energy, Mr Speaker. That is the opportunity for our country. That is the opportunity for our nation, but only with the right policies. A very important policy, part of that, is the National Reconstruction Fund, which recently passed the House, and congratulations to the Industry Minister, and we look forward to it passing the Senate as well. This is very important for co-investment. The other part of the equation is the framework necessary to encourage that investment with industry and business. And, Mr Speaker, today is exactly 100 days until the 1st of July. On the 1st of July, this country, after a decade of denial and delay, can have a policy regime which encourages that investment in renewable energy, which encourages that investment in decarbonisation. That is the opportunity before the House. Now, I'm asked by the honourable member what the consequences would be of not passing it. Well, we know the coalition is against it. They're against everything.
Order.
The member for Bass has described her own party's position as going nowhere, and of course she is correct. But what can't go nowhere is climate policy in this country. And that is the opportunity for this parliament over the next fortnight. The consequences of the safeguard reforms not passing are very real for our region, very real for the Pacific, because our targets of 43%, which were legislated by this parliament last year, will not be met without passing the safeguard mechanism. Our projections show that, in fact, the achievement by 2030 will be 35%, Mr Speaker. Now, that is the choice facing this parliament. Targets can be set. It's easy to call for higher targets. It's easy to call for more action. The difficult part is implementing that action. And this government is putting action forward before this parliament for endorsement and putting action forward to the business community and the country for cooperation to work together to get this job done. It is not acceptable for this country, after 10 years, to say 35% is good enough. We have to aim higher and do more and work harder, Mr Speaker, and that's exactly what this government is inviting the parliament to do with us. So the consequences of not passing this legislation, of not passing safeguard reforms for business who are crying out for this certainty, for people who are crying out for more action, are very real indeed. This government will continue to implement the policies we took to the election, will continue to work with people of good faith and goodwill to see them implemented well, and we will ensure that this parliament makes progress, not a point. The choice is to squander this opportunity or seize it. It's time to seize it.
Before I call the member for Ryan, I'd like to acknowledge guests in the gallery. I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is Ernie Camp, the Mayor of Burkdown Shire, and Troy Fraser, the CEO of Doomadgee Council, whose regions have recently experienced catastrophic flooding. Also in the gallery are representatives from Murray Irrigation, and also I see in the gallery today representatives and volunteers from Meals on Wheels Australia, including its staff and volunteers. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you all. I give the call to the honourable member for Ryan.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Water. The massive fish kill in Menindee in New South Wales is a disaster and horrific evidence of the drastic climate crisis. Minister, given the New South Wales government's mismanagement of its water, will you take over management of the river system to reinstate water buybacks to save the river? And, Minister, would you drink the water from Menindee?
Order. I give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water. Order. Members on my right, members on my left. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, and I want to thank the honourable member for her question about the very important task that we have of implementing the Murray-Darling Basin Plan in full, something that we are absolutely committed to on this side of the chamber. It is absolutely devastating to see the events in Menindee, the mass fish kills. Honestly, the interjections from those opposite are so pointless. If you had done anything in 9 years to deliver on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, we would be in a better place now.
Order. The Leader of the Nationals, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The member Hasler.
I have recovered more water towards the additional environmental water target in 9 months than you did in 9 years, because you tied up the plan in brown tape. You deliberately sabotaged it. Now, I want to address this very important question that the member has asked about Menindee. 4 years ago we saw mass fish kills. We're seeing them again. Different causes. This time we're talking about deoxygenated black water that's as a result of the floods and the very high temperatures we've seen. Devastating for the town of Menindee and for the environment. I have personally contacted the New South Wales Water Minister to offer my support to him. The Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Commonwealth Environment Water Holder is working very closely with New South Wales, that obviously have primary responsibility for addressing this catastrophic situation once again in Menindee. But the more important underlying question that the member is asking is, how do we work cooperatively with the states and territories to deliver on this plan? It is a very important question, because for 9 years we saw so very little progress from those opposite. What we are doing is progressing with the infrastructure projects that actually stack up. We are working across the Murray-Darling Basin system to open purchasing of water towards the Bridging the Gap target. We have to complete that Bridging the Gap target. We are working with fantastic organisations like the one we've got visiting us today, Murray Irrigation Limited, to deliver on the sort of plans that they want to see, to make sure that they have the water they need to meet the food and fibre requirements of our agricultural sector. So for our towns, for our agricultural sector, and very importantly for our environment, we will deliver on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan in full.
The call to the honourable member for Dunkley.
Thank you. Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How does the AUKUS agreement, announced last week by the government, invest in our capability and in our relationships?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Dunkley for her question and for her commitment to making Australia a safer and more resilient country. We are, as a government, investing in our capability, and we're also investing in our relationships. This represents the single biggest investment in Australia's defence capability in our history, and the single biggest leap in terms of capacity and use of technology in our history as well. Importantly, this will be an Australian sovereign capability. Once the Australian flag appears on a plane, a piece of equipment, a ship, a submarine, then it is controlled by Australia, and it operates at the direction of the government of Australia. In this case, what we'll be working towards is the building of nuclear-powered submarines in Adelaide that will be built by Australian workers with Australian products, having Australian skills and producing, of course, 20,000 direct Australian jobs, as well as a massive multiplier effect on our capacity to have advanced manufacturing in this country. Now, there is a cost to any major project such as this, and we have put out the estimated costings there for all to see in the interest of transparency. And what that represents going forward is about 0.15% of GDP. Now, our defence budget will be at least 2% of GDP. What I have said is that in future, I said at the Lowy Institute before the last election, and I continue to say, I expect that our defence budget in the future will actually grow higher than 2%, but certainly won't be lower. Therefore, this particular project will represent under 10% of our defence budget. So when we sat around the NSC and other bodies and worked through, is this the right thing to do? You have to come to the assessment based upon, does this increase the capability of our defence by more than 10%? The answer to that is overwhelmingly yes. Overwhelmingly yes. They will stay underwater for longer, they're faster, they don't need to snort, come up as often. This unlocks a set of transformative opportunities. It will shape and strengthen and grow Australia's economy for decades into the future.
Call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Research by Finder shows that Victorians with a mortgage have seen, on average, monthly repayments rise by $1,083 every month. Yet on Monday, when the Prime Minister was asked if he could identify a single Australian paying less on their interest rates, he said, "It's been a pretty good 10 months." Why is the Prime Minister so out of touch, and why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Order. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Prime Minister will be heard in silence. He has a call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Once again, the Treasurer puts on sad face because he again misses out on a question from the Shadow Treasurer.
Order.
From the Shadow Treasurer. The Shadow Treasurer ignores the fact that inflation had taken off before Labor took office, and indeed on their watch, the March 2022 quarter, inflation jumped by 2.1%, the highest quarterly rise this century, no matter who was in government, the highest rise. Now, after the election, it certainly emerged that the former government ignored the Treasury warnings which were there and used its final budget to unleash a desperate vote-buying spending spree, which of course added fuel to the inflation fire. A former government source described it as ordering the entree, the main and the dessert. They also ignore the fact, when it comes to interest rates, that the former Assistant Treasurer here presided over an interest rate increase that rose 5 times in a row from 5.5% to 6.75%. So the truth is that, the Shadow Treasurer opposite pretends that there wasn't inflation before the election, when in fact inflation was having the highest single quarterly increase in this century, and he ignores the fact that interest rates began rising on their watch.
Give the call to the member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. How will Australia's nuclear-powered submarines open opportunities in science and research and create a skilled workforce for generations to come?
Give the call to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence. The Deputy Leader of the... No. I have been patient with this issue. When people are asking questions from both sides that be heard in silence, before ministers speak, that is not the time to interject. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition continually abuses that. I'm just reminding all members for one last time, you can't expect respect shown on one side and not shown to the other. It's got to be discipline, and it's got to be each time the question and answer begins. Give the call to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I acknowledge the member for his question and acknowledge his advocacy on behalf of South Australia's defence industry. At the BAE facility at Barrow-in-Furness, where BAE is building Britain's Astute-class submarines and will build the future SSN AUKUS submarines. There is a training academy on site which is hugely impactful to see. It was established in 2018, and since then it's seen the training of 1,500 apprentices. And when you walk around the facility seeing young people starting out, seeing older people who are retraining for a rewarding career in building submarines, you understand the power of that program in providing fantastic livelihoods for thousands of people, as well as building the skills base of an entire nation. Last Wednesday, I signed with the Premier of South Australia a cooperation agreement between the Commonwealth and South Australia, which will see the establishment of a training academy at the Osborne Naval Yard in South Australia, right next to where we will be building our future nuclear-powered submarines. And this academy is going to provide training in all the skills necessary to build a submarine, from specialist welding to pipe fitting through the electrical trades, a seamless transition from the classroom to the workplace. But in addition to trade training, this program is going to see a massive lift in the teaching of science across our universities. Now, today we have significant schools in nuclear physics at ANU and the University of New South Wales, but in mathematics, in engineering and computer science, in the new areas of quantum and AI, this program will see a massive boost in the teaching of science in this country, which is so important. Because as a nation, we have to change our cultural relationship to science. We have to see science much more front and centre in the way in which we see the world. Now, last week was a really big moment in the defence history of our country, but in truth it was also a really big moment in the science history and in the skills history of our country. And as students looking to pursue an education in technical trades or in science, they can now look to a really exciting career in building our future nuclear-powered submarines with a much greater sense of optimism and certainty.
Give a call to the honourable for Gippsland.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Local Government and Member for Eden-Monaro. I referred to the Minister for Transport's admission yesterday that the Growing Regions Program funding guidelines haven't been finalised 10 months since the federal election. Does the Minister for Local Government agree that Labor's failure to deliver this program in a timely manner means local councils will be forced to build less with the funding when it's finally provided?
Order. Order. The member for Page. Can I hear from the Leader of the House?
Just in terms of the minister it's directed to, by definition in the way that question was framed, he went through the minister responsible and then directed the question somewhere else.
Yes, he did.
I'll hear from the manager.
Well, the question was directed to the Minister for Local Government, and she has portfolio responsibility, and we ought to hear from her.
It was directed to the Minister for Local Government, so I'll call the Minister for Local Government.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you very much for the question. There is no doubt it is incredibly important for our local councils to have certainty. And I think what happened over the last 10 years is that there was no certainty. Because these guys, those opposite, needed a colour-coded spreadsheet to actually deal with any applications from councils. We have 546 local councils across the country, and what we saw was councils spending time and money applying for grants, and they were never assessed on their merits because you guys needed a colour-coded spreadsheet. I mean, you know that councils have limited budgets, and what you did to them was put them through a process where they expended money, they expended ratepayers' money, expecting they'd have a fair and transparent process, and you never delivered one.
Order. The Minister was... Order. Members on my right. The Minister will resume. The member for Bennelong. The Minister for Social Services. the Minister for Infrastructure will cease interjecting as well. I'll hear from the leader. The member for Barker. I'm trying to hear from the Leader of the Opposition. On a point of order,
Speaker,
from the Leader of the Opposition.
on relevance, firstly, thank you for allowing this minister to speak. It's a great insight. Secondly,
what's the point of order,
Mr. Speaker? It refers to the minister's admission yesterday that the Growing Regions Program funding guidelines haven't been finalised for 10 months.
Right,
Can she please go to that part of the question?
Resume your seat. The question. Well, order. The question was directed to the Minister for Local Government. She's answering the question. Order. She's had a preamble. I'm going to ask her to... Order, members on my left. And I'm going to give her the call in continuation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's incredibly important that we engage local councils, and what we've done, the first time ever, is actually invited those local government associations. We've invited local councils to have input into the guidelines because we take seriously collaboration with our local government sector. This is a program that was announced in October because those opposite rorted building better regions so much that the whole program became tainted. So we've announced $1 billion over 3 years in 2 specific programs. We've consulted with local government. We are working with them because they are a trusted delivery partner of our federal government.
Order. The Leader of the Nationals will cease interjecting immediately, will be warned. When the House comes to order, members on my right, the member for Barker is now officially warned. Give the call to the member for Cunningham.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Homelessness. What does today's census data reveal about homelessness in Australia? What is the Albanese Labor government doing to improve the situation? And why is the Housing Australia Future Fund an important part of the government's approach?
Call to the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Homelessness and the Minister for Small Business.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Cunningham for that important question. I'm sure that she, like many people in this place today, have seen the latest data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics showing that the number of people in Australia experiencing homelessness has sadly climbed again by 6,000 people from 2016 to 2021. It is of great concern, I'm sure, to everybody in this place that almost 123,000 Australians were reported as experiencing homelessness on census night. I'm sure that many of you in this place, like me, receive contact from community members every single day with the challenges of finding and keeping a safe place to call home. I know that these challenges are reaching new people who have never been homeless or at risk of homelessness before. And in a country like Australia today, this is unacceptable. There's a lot to do to turn this around. And we're not acting alone, but we do have a commitment to deliver our ambitious housing reform agenda with immediate action alongside medium and long-term goals. Today, I announce that the government continues to invest into youth homelessness through the $91.7 million commitment to the Reconnect program over the next 3 years. We know that family breakdown is the leading cause of youth homelessness in this country. In fact, on 2021 census night, 23% of all people experiencing homelessness were aged between 12 and 24 years of age. I'm sure that we all think that that is unacceptable. Now, our Housing Australia Future Fund, $10 billion fund, will be the largest boost to social and affordable housing in more than a decade. And I remind members in this place that 4,000 of the 30,000 homes are for women and children fleeing family violence and older women at risk of homelessness, which are the fastest growing group of people when it comes to homelessness. Of course, we have acted immediately by broadening the National Housing Infrastructure Facility with that up to $575 million, with announcements and construction underway on projects already. And of course, working with the states and territories on the National Housing Accord, the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, and of course we've started work on a National Housing and Homelessness Plan, which is a 10-year plan, 5+5, working together. What we need to do is line up the Housing and Homelessness Plan with the Accord and with the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, and have all tiers of government working together on this to turn it around. And I say to members in this place, seriously, I know our housing reform agenda is ambitious. It's ambitious because it needs to be. We all need to do more. All of us in this place have a responsibility to make sure that more Australians have a safe, affordable place to call home, and that's why I again reiterate my call for people in the Senate particularly to get the Housing Australia Future Fund through the Parliament and get more homes on the ground quickly.
Yeah. Call to the member for Herbert.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Peter Splain, an elderly gentleman on a fixed income in my electorate of Herbert, has contacted me about the impact of the government's cost of living crisis. He told me that he's having to choose between cooking his dinner and turning on his air conditioning because of the spiralling power price increases. Can the Prime Minister inform Mr Splain when he'll receive the promised $275 cut to his power bill? Why is the Prime Minister so out of touch? And why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Very. Call to the Prime Minister.
You voted to make it worse.
Thanks, Mr
Member
Speaker.
for McEwen.
I thank the member for Herbert for his question, and I hope he informed his constituent that he voted against $1.5 billion of energy price relief. I hope he did that. I hope he also informed his constituent that when the Queensland Government took regulatory action to put a cap on coal prices in order to take pressure off the system, he also was against that because he voted against cheaper gas prices here in Australia as well, with the cap on gas of $12 that we brought to this parliament, and that received support by the Liberal government in New South Wales, the Labor opposition in New South Wales, which is responsible, but also the Queensland government, and indeed received the unanimous support of every state and territory government around Australia, Labor and Coalition, because they all understood what the circumstances were that we were dealing with.
Deputy Leader of the
Now,
Opposition.
we will continue to take action to take pressure off the cost of living. That is why tomorrow will be, after tomorrow is 100 days till cheaper childcare comes in. January 1, cheaper medicines came in. Fee-free TAFE is in place already. Now, we know what those opposite would do if they had the chance, if they had to deal with issues, because we've seen what they've done before. The Leader of the Opposition's biggest idea was a tax on GP visits. A tax on GP visits, wanting to see the costs of visiting a GP rise by $7. But he didn't just do that. Not only did he not reduce the cost of prescriptions, his big idea was to raise the cost of prescriptions by $5.
Order.
No wonder he was seen as Australia's worst health minister.
Prime Minister will pause. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The order. So do I. The Prime order on my right will cease interjecting immediately. I want to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, it's a point of order on relevance. It was a very specific question about the member for Herbert's constituent. The Prime Minister is now meandering into matters of history. If he doesn't have an answer on the difficulties the member's constituent is facing, he should cease.
That's fine. Resume your seat. The question was started with the impacts of cost of living crisis and about choices, where to spend, and the constituents' bills. I'll give the call to the Prime Minister. Order! Order. Going to hear from the Prime Minister, and I'll make sure he is in order, and he has the call.
Thanks very much. And I am talking about the cost of living, because not only was the GP tax going to be imposed, there was a rise in the cost of prescriptions that was a part of the budget process as well. But there's another idea that's sort of been forgotten a little bit that he had as well. He had this: the government will remove the restrictions on state and territory governments that prevent hospital emergency departments charging a fee for presentation. That was this bloke's idea.
Order.
On cost of living. There's some people in this chamber mightn't remember that.
Order.
But I do.
Members on my left.
But I do, and that's exactly what he would do if ever he had the opportunity to have his hand on the budget again.
Member Deakin, Prime Minister's time has concluded. Give the call to the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. What does today's census data reveal about the situation with veteran homelessness in Australia, and what is the federal Labor Albanese government's plan to combat veteran homelessness?
Give the call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Solomon for his question and his unwavering support for not just the veterans in the Darwin Palmerston area, but across this country, and especially those that are experiencing homelessness. One of the things that the 2021 census revealed to us last year was that there are some 581,000 people in Australia that have or are serving our Australian Defence Force. And the data that has been released today shows that on census night, 1,555 veterans were homeless. But in addition to those veterans that were homeless on census night, we also know that there are many that are experiencing marginal housing. Those that are at risk of homelessness, those that are couch surfing, those that are staying with family and friends or in temporary accommodation in caravan parks or the like. That leaves these veterans in a very vulnerable position. And of course, for any veterans that are experiencing homelessness or feel that they're at risk of homelessness, I do ask them to contact the Department of Veterans Affairs on 1800 838 372 or Open Arms on 1800 011 046. But I've been asked about what are we doing to support those veterans that are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. And the Labor government has an ambitious agenda when it comes to this issue. And of course it is part of our $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund plan, from which there will be $30 million that will go to supporting veterans experiencing homelessness and at risk of homelessness, not just with housing itself, but with the wraparound services to support them. And I was quite happy to see that on Monday, Senator O'Sullivan, in the other place, was talking about the plans from the Royal Air Force Association of WA to build an Andrew Russell Veterans Living Centre based on the one in South Australia to support veterans in Western Australia. And I met with RAFA WA last year to talk about those plans. Earlier this year I met with VASI RSL from Victoria to talk about their plans for homelessness services to support veterans with wraparound services to support them. These are great plans that are coming forward from our ex-service organisations and housing sectors. Unfortunately, they can't act until we get access to the funding through the establishment of the Housing Australia Future Fund. So I say to Senator O'Sullivan in the other place, instead of being part of a Liberal National Green coalition against the Housing Australia Future Fund, you all have an opportunity in the other place to support this legislation and to support veterans experiencing homelessness and at risk of homelessness.
Have you concluded your answer? On a point of order, I'll call the member for New England and he'll need to state what the point of order is.
It's one on this. He's used the word coalition. You've given express words that he's not supposed to use that.
Order. I'll hear from the order. Hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the reference that was just made by the Minister, it's not that you'd previously ruled that term as an unparliamentary term, it's that you've ruled that it can't be used with reference to the formal coalition of the Liberal and National Party. The member just referred to a coalition of the Liberal Party, the National Party and the Greens in the Senate. Now, if the member for New England thinks that's the official coalition, then I guess it would have to be withdrawn under the previous ruling.
We're just going to order. Resume your seat. I'm just going to remind all members. I didn't hear. I was trying to listen to exactly. There was too much noise about what the minister was saying. I'll remind all members Referring to the coalition is as the coalition. Okay? Before I call the member for Kooyong, I'd like to acknowledge some special guests in the gallery. We have the G21 Geelong Region Alliance and mayors of Greater Geelong, Golden Plains, Queenscliff, Surf Coast and Colac-Otway. A very warm welcome to you all. To give the call to the honourable member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Under your safeguard mechanism, big emitters can buy as many offsets as they want. There is no ceiling to the offsets polluters can buy. The cost of those offsets will be less than 0.1% of their profits, giving polluters no reason to cut their emissions. Will you concede that there is a flaw in your lack of ceilings?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question and her engagement with her colleagues on this issue, and further engagement to come this afternoon, Mr Speaker. But I do not accept the premise of the honourable member's question. I do not. It is the case that the government is allowing access to offsets in our safeguard mechanism reforms. Absolutely we are. Absolutely we are, as we should. Because this is an ambitious plan, Mr Speaker, and when you're engaging in an ambitious plan, you need to give industry the flexibility to implement that plan. Now, I would invite the honourable member, and I say with all due respect, the honourable member, if people are going to argue for a cap on the use of carbon credits, they need to explain how hard-to-abate sectors will achieve the targets. How will cement achieve its targets with the technology that is currently emerging and is not yet available without access to AUKUS and carbon credits, Mr Speaker? When you are applying this reform to 215 of the country's biggest emitters, with varying degrees of technology available to them, it is absolutely vital to give them access to the carbon credits. What this framework does is provide the incentive to firms to invest in abatement as it emerges. There are some sectors with good abatement technology available to them today. There are other sectors where it will be available in the next couple of years, and there are other sectors that will be hard to abate for some time to come. Our regime implements that, and I say to the honourable members and to all honourable members and to all senators, amendments and suggestions and improvements are fine. The most important thing is that the package passes the parliament, Mr Speaker, because then we have the framework in place not only for today but for years to come.
Give the call to the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. How is the Albanese Labor government's cheaper medicines policy continuing to improve the lives of Australians?
Call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Newcastle for her question, because I know just how hard she campaigned last year on her promise to the people of Newcastle to strengthen Medicare and deliver cheaper medicines. And she knows that in just the first 2 months of this year, her constituents have saved $250,000 on 25,000 cheaper scripts, because on the January the 1st, the Albanese government delivered on our promise to implement the biggest cut to the price of medicines in the 75-year history of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, saving Australians in just 2 months $36 million already, over 3.2 million cheaper scripts. And even before that, Mr Speaker, last July, we slashed the maximum amount that pensioners and concession card holders would pay for their medicines needs by 25%, ensuring that those people across a given year would pay no more than $5.05 per week for all of their medicines needs, no matter how many scripts they filled. In September, we cut the price of 2,000 brands of medicines, delivering $130 million back into the pockets of hard-working Australians. And in November, the Minister for Social Services delivered on our promise to give more self-funded retirees access to a seniors health card that will give them cheaper medicines and access to bulk billed GP visits. Already, more than 10,000 self-funded retirees have that card in their hands who didn't have it before last November. Mr Speaker, last Thursday I had the privilege of visiting pharmacy at Knox in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and I met with pharmacists there, Dat and Mel, who run this terrific 24-hour pharmacy. Incidentally, Mr Speaker, can I say they told me that their books were overflowing with their constituents coming in to get that additional dose of COVID vaccines, because across the parliament we know that community pharmacies are playing an increasingly central role in our vaccine program, including the new COVID booster dose. But on cheaper medicines, Mr Speaker, Mel told me as well that she had countless patients coming up to the counter shocked, genuinely shocked, that they're actually saving money on cheaper medicines. They asked her whether perhaps a mistake had been made. They asked, really, is that all that I have to pay? Mr Speaker, Australians right around the country are benefiting from the Albanese government's policy on cheaper medicines. And pharmacists know that this isn't just good for their hip pocket, as good as it is for their hip pocket, it's also good for their health, because hundreds of thousands of Australians up until now have been going out with scripts that their doctors have said are important for their medicines. Medicines cheaper are not only good for cost of living, they're making Australians live healthier lives.
Call to the honourable member for Flinders.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Last week's Westpac Melbourne Institute survey of Consumer Sentiment Index was below 80 for 2 months in a row. Chief Economist Bill Evans said, runs of sub-80 reads have only been seen during the late 1980s, early 1990s recession and in the Banana Republic period of concern in 1986. Why does consumer confidence always collapse when Labor is in government? Why is the Prime Minister so out of touch? And why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Order. The Minister for Home Affairs and Cyber Security, the Minister for Skills or Seasons. Members on the Minister for Home Affairs is warned. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the Shadow Treasurer for her question. Mr Speaker, there was a there's been a range of figures come out, as happens on our economy, and in
the member for Deakin. Order. The Prime Minister will just pause. The member for Deakin. The member for Deakin will cease. If you interject one more time, you will be ejected from the chamber for the second day in a row. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
In February, 64,600 jobs were created. What that means is that more than 250,000 jobs have been created since we came to office. More than 250,000. Indeed. More jobs created in our first 6 months in office than were created in the first 6 months of any government since they started keeping these records. Now, Senator Cash had this to say on the 16th of February. We gave one challenge in relation to the jobs market, and that was to keep unemployment in Australia as low as possible. Well, we've done that. And that is a key to people's living standards. We acknowledge that many people are doing it tough because of the inflationary circumstances. The idea that Happy Pete's off again, Mr Speaker. He tries so hard. His mind is telling him that the research says he's got to be more cheerful, but he's just incapable. He's just incapable of doing it. What we're doing is a range of things that will assist Australians. That's what the National Reconstruction Fund is about, new industries and new jobs. Those opposite, just say no to that. We just heard from the Housing Minister about the measures that are there in the Housing Australia Future Fund and the specific measures that are there from the Veterans Affairs Minister to help our veterans, but they say no to that as well. They had the opportunity to vote with the government on energy price relief, and they voted against that as well last December. On every measure, those opposite just say no to any measure that is put forward that is going to make a positive difference. They come in here, they talk the economy down, they talk Australia down. Remember when our industrial relations legislation was being debated? They said that would be the end. We'd all have general strikes by now. Where are they? Where are they? They just run a scare campaign. They just run a scare campaign, but nothing so scary as their lack of ambition for Australia.
Time has concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Lawler.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. What has the Royal Commission into Robodebt uncovered about what led to vulnerable people being targeted by the former coalition government's unlawful scheme?
Call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
There's been more than 100 witnesses to the Royal Commission, and broadly you can categorise the tenor of their evidence into two groups. There's those witnesses who gave evidence of courage, integrity and strength, and then there was the evidence of those who were in charge of the scheme. And those in charge of the scheme tended to have memory loss. They tended to blame others. And I want to talk about one witness who blamed a very special person in this House. Specifically, the House needs to hear how the member for Fadden blamed the member for Cook for specifically targeting vulnerable cohorts. And I rely on the transcript from the Royal Commission for the benefit of my friend, the Manager of Opposition Business, from page 4235. Now, the member for Fadden explained how the former Prime Minister, the member for Cook, wanted to include what was referred to as vulnerable cohorts in the Robodebt scheme. In this context, vulnerable cohorts meant—
The Minister will pause and I will hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr Speaker, you've issued numerous rulings on this.
Order. The member for Lyons is warned.
You have repeatedly directed this minister to stick strictly to the evidence and not to draw conclusions. He is frankly flouting and mocking your rulings in the language that he's just used, and you should, I submit, remind him that he needs to expressly stick to reporting the evidence and not going any further in offering a concluded view, as you have correctly on a number of occasions ruled.
The Manager of Opposition Business is correct. He is reading directly from the transcript, and if he was to conclude a view, you can be assured I will make the relevant decision. The Minister in continuation, and he will be heard in silence.
And I thank the member for Bradfield. I'm not sure the member for Fadden will when I read the direct quotes.
The Minister will continue with his answer.
Now, the member for Stirling, the former member for Stirling, Michael Keenan, actually paused some of the Robodebt on vulnerable cohorts in 2018. There was an election in 2019. The new minister was under pressure, and this is clear from his evidence, to reinstate the vulnerable cohorts. The member for Fadden said, and I quote—
The Manager will resume his seat. The Minister, I want to remind him this is the last time. He's got to refer to the evidence, not give his opinion on the evidence. I hope that is clear, otherwise he'll be seated. So
the member for Fadden's specific words about reinstating the Robodebt on vulnerable people was it wasn't conscionable. So the view was to kick it into the long grass until so much time as the question had been resolved. Member Fadden said by deftly manoeuvring the Cabinet Secretary, he was able to delay a decision on re-including vulnerable people. But when asked by counsel assisting why he didn't just do as Keenan had and say not happening, he said, "At this time I was getting a fair bit of pressure from the Cabinet Office that to meet the savings requirement was needed, and I needed to bring forward a Cabinet submission on this." When pressed about the Cabinet Secretary's authority to force this being brought forward, and whether ministerial responsibility is subject to Cabinet Secretary's desires, Member for Fadden says the Cabinet Secretary speaks on behalf of the Prime Minister. So if the Cabinet Secretary is not happy, the next call is coming from the Prime Minister. Asked in a different way, the Member for Fadden said the Prime Minister signs off on everything that he wants to come forward. The Member for Fadden made very clear in the transcript, which I'm sure you haven't read, that the member for Cook made him do it, Your Honour.
Order. The order. When the House comes to order, I'll hear members on my right. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting, as I'd like to hear from the member for Goldstein in silence. She has the call.
To the Prime Minister. In your AUKUS speech, you referred to Australia's proud leadership in non-proliferation, but constituents tell me they fear a nuclear arms race because of AUKUS. Does the government plan to merely meet safeguards or now join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in line with a motion you successfully proposed at the Labor National Conference in 2018, seconded by the now Defence Minister and reaffirmed in 2021?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for her question and for her commitment on these issues, including to nuclear non-proliferation. The Labor Party has a proud history of championing practical, international non-proliferation and disarmament efforts, going back to the work that Gareth Evans and the Hawke government did, going through to the work that was undertaken under the Rudd and Gillard governments, and that will continue to occur under a government that I'm proud to lead. We are steadfast in our support for the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as the cornerstone of the global non-proliferation and disarmament regime. And there is no question that Australia recognises the devastating consequences for humanity of any use of nuclear weapons. And tragically, we've seen that authoritarian tin pot dictator, Vladimir Putin, threaten the use of nuclear weapons against the people of Ukraine. So we know the consequences of proliferation. We are redoubling our efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons, including by helping others to meet the same high standards to which we hold ourselves. Now, on the issue of nuclear propulsion for submarines, it's important to draw the distinction. They have nuclear propulsion. They will not have nuclear weapons. We are not acquiring nuclear weapons.
Order. The Prime Minister will pause. I'll hear from the member for Goldstein on point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, the question was, does the government plan to sign the treaty?
Well, the question for part of it is asking about a decision of a national conference, which under the standing orders is not applicable to the Prime Minister. So for that part of the question, he can delete that and I'll ask him in continuation.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. In the lead-up to seems like a long time ago, I've got to say, to the San Diego announcement, we have said publicly that myself and the Defence Minister and the Foreign Minister spoke to more than 60 world leaders and briefed them. What we also did was we had the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Secretary-General Grossi, in close liaison with us, the political leadership of this country, as well as our defence leadership, to make sure that everything we were doing was completely in compliance with our commitments on the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, but also that everything we have done is completely in accord with the Treaty of Rarotonga, which is very important for our Pacific Island friends. We made sure that we got that right. Now, on the issue of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, Australia certainly has a view very clearly that a world without nuclear weapons would be a very good thing. We don't acquire them ourselves. We wish that they weren't there. What we will do, though, is we'll work systematically and methodically through the issues in accordance with the commitments that were made in the national platform.
Prime Minister's
They're there.
Time has concluded. Give the call to the member for Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. What has the Royal Commission into Robodebt revealed about the true human cost of the former coalition government's unlawful scheme?
The call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
Thank the member for Cornwall for her question. The Royal Commission has revealed a terrible human cost to this monstrously illegal scheme. I know that when the Prime Minister announced the Royal Commission with my colleagues, the Attorney-General and Minister for Social Services and myself, that the current Leader of the Opposition called it a witch hunt, just a witch hunt. So I perhaps ask the Leader of the Opposition to reconsider calling the Royal Commission a witch hunt in the light of the evidence of Jennifer Miller and Kath Madrick. Both women gave evidence to the Royal Commission. Both women I've met, both women I respect, both women lost sons. In the evidence to the Royal Commission, she talks about her son Jared, who was robodebted in May of 2019, and after receiving what turned out to be a false debt notice, he took his own life within hours. Kath describes Jared, and perhaps we can't bring him back, but we can listen to the mother's evidence. He was a polite, had really good manners, but he also, if he applied himself to something, would do very well at it. He was captain of the school in his primary school. He was very good at swimming and rugby. But the best thing about Jared is he was very unique in his way, that our closeness. We were so very close. He just displayed his love for me quite openly. After Jared's death, Kath wrote to various politicians, including the then Prime Minister, the member for Cook, and the then Minister for Government Services, the member for Fadden. She says she's never heard back from them. Not even a sorry for your loss, she says. Jennifer Miller, another bereaved mother of Robodebt, in her evidence to Royal Commission, talked about her son Reece. Reece was creative, he was artistic. Jenny has said that she hopes that this Royal Commission sets up a precedent, that if you're working in public office, you're there to work for the people. So do your job and do it properly. She's also noted that throughout Robodebt, it all became very sly, and just everyone was lying and covering each other's backs, and it was just really both heartbreaking but also vindicating, seeing that we've been able to get the truth out there for Reece. This Royal Commission is not a witch hunt, Leader of the Opposition. It's tearing down the walls of legal professional privilege and the inner workings of the former government. There has been courage and leadership and ethics on display in this Royal Commission. It's just not been the ministers and the senior public servants. This is an examination of the worst abuse of Australian citizens committed deliberately. There's been no legal argument advanced to defend it, no moral argument. Thank goodness we're having this Robodebt Royal Commission.
Give the call to the honourable member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The cost of living crisis under this government is leading to record demand for help and support across Australia, as many families struggle to even afford the essentials. Lifeline experienced their biggest January on record. Other charities are seeing increases in requests for support. Food Bank, the Salvos and Vinnie's among them. Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
The call to the Prime Minister. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister has the call and will be heard in silence without constant interjecting.
I've got time.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will remain silent for the rest of question time. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Moore for her question, and I acknowledge that so many people are doing it tough. That is always someone who is needing support from Food Bank, or in my local area, Addy Road, is one too many. And that's why the government is doing what we can to make a difference on the cost of living. That's why we have fee-free TAFE, that's why we have cheaper medicines, that's why from tomorrow we will have cheaper childcare. That's why we're pleased with the unemployment figures and the fact that so many jobs have been created in our first 10 months in office, something that seems to be denigrated by those opposite. But we also know that from the Robodebt evidence that those opposite presided over a circumstance whereby the most vulnerable people who were Centrelink recipients not only were getting their income in a tough circumstance, they were actually getting these massive illegal debts. Now, one of the people who gave evidence before the Robodebt Royal Commission was Madison. She said this: "I was so overwhelmed by the debt and feeling as though I was in trouble from Centrelink and the government that I attempted suicide. I'm very grateful to have survived, but I know the other victims of Robodebt were not as lucky. I want the former government to understand that you need to get things right." That is what Madison, a survivor, had to say. Nathan Carney had this to say: "I'm still angry at the people involved who didn't speak up, the people who disregarded human decency to chase the next step in their career or to exact revenge on the computer-assigned undeserving poor. The Royal Commission is necessary. A lot of us still need a resolution. We remember the incessant debt collector calls. We remember how the debts blew out all our other living expenses." That's what those opposite presided over, as a conscious decision, even after they were advised that it was illegal. And the minister at the time said, "Oh, well, that's what cabinet ministers do."
Order. Prime Minister, time is concluded. Order. The member for Batten will cease interjecting. The member for Fremantle. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The member for Kingswood Smith. Give the call to the member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Petrie will cease interjecting immediately.
My
Reset the clock. I'll
question
give the
is-
call to the member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. What steps is the Albanese Labor government taking to clean up the mess left by the former Liberal National government with its illegal Robodebt scheme?
Give the call to the Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Holt, who I know has been a strong advocate for those impacted by the Robodebt scheme. Robodebt was a failure in public policy. It caused suffering to around 400,000 people, including some of the most marginalised people in our community. Many vulnerable Australians had unlawful debts mounted against them. Some of them were hunted down, chased by debt collectors, hounded for repayments for debts which didn't make sense and in many cases they didn't owe. Rather than being interested in the integrity of the system, the former government seemed to see recovering social security debts as a means to balance the budget at all costs. And we know the consequences were terrible. It is our commitment to ensure that this failure of public policy never happens again. And that is why we established the Robodebt Royal Commission as a priority in coming to government. Australians gave evidence to the Robodebt Royal Commission describing their sheer terror after receiving often inaccurate debt notices for tens of thousands of dollars. One victim had to consider selling her home, that she would lose everything to manage the debt which she was inaccurately issued with. Another reported feeling like concerns about unlawful debt applied to her that fell on deaf ears. She reported how the Robodebt methodology of income averaging caused a debt to be raised against her when it shouldn't have, and she reported how debt collectors viciously attacked her in their attempts to recover money. She said no one listened to her. The Robodebt Royal Commission has been the first step in ensuring we can fully understand what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. After establishing the Robodebt Royal Commission, This government took action to provide some certainty to the 197,000 people who had a Robodebt review commenced but not completed. It was still hanging over their heads. These reviews were closed by the Albanese government last year, ending the uncertainty and worry that many people endured as a result. Further action will be informed by the Royal Commission's recommendations that will be handed down in June to make sure that this never happens again. This government, the Albanese government, is committed to delivering a better Australia, and this means delivering a social security system that is there to support Australians in need, not demonise them and stigmatise them.
Give the call to the honourable member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this Labor government, business confidence is falling and consumer confidence is at near historic lows, not seen since the 1990s Keating recession. With mortgage costs going up and up, inflation at 30-year highs, energy bills rising again on 1 July and families increasingly unable to afford the basics, why did the Prime Minister break his promise of cheaper mortgages and a $275 cut to household power bills? Prime Minister, why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about business confidence. Well, I tell you what, there's a bit of legislation before the Senate that's precisely about business confidence. The safeguard mechanism is the most important thing that we can do to give certainty to our major companies, in Australia. And the Leader of the Opposition went along to the AFR Business Summit and he said this. He was asked about the strong business support for the government safeguard mechanism. And he said this, certainly from some sectors there's a very different story, and that's been the private conversations that we've had with some of those CEOs and some of the boards. Now, I asked the Leader of the Opposition, who are the boards? Who are the CEOs who say they're against the safeguard mechanism? Because my friend Phil Curry had an observation about that. My friend Phil Curry said
on my
this.
left.
After Opposition Leader Peter Dutton reaffirmed the coalition would vote against the legislation and claimed some companies were urging him privately to block it, business leaders urged a rethink. Business Council of Australia President Tim Reid told the Australian Financial Review Business Summit, "We are disappointed with the opposition's position." He said the safeguard mechanism was the best available option for decarbonisation. And he questioned Mr Dutton's claim about businesses saying one thing in public and another thing in private. He went on to say this, "I haven't had any come out and say they got this wrong." Mr Reid said, of the 44 BCA members who will be affected by the mechanism, so it's 44 in favour, 0 against the safeguard mechanism. The Leader of the Opposition was caught out trying to verbal the business community to the business community. They were sitting there at the conference and he's telling them, no, you don't know what you think. I know better what you think. Oh, it's just extraordinary. No ideas, no alternatives, no credibility.
Give the call to the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. Why is Australia so far behind on our national recycling targets? How is the Albanese Labor government cleaning up the mess it inherited on the environment from those opposite?
I give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Hasluck for her question about recycling. I know she is absolutely committed to strengthening recycling in this country, as we all are. And it's very true that we inherited ambitious recycling targets from those opposite. We were very happy to sign up to those targets at the time. Sadly, those opposite in the 4 years after setting those targets did nothing to achieve them. In fact, they set a plastic packaging recycling target of 70% by 2025. Sounds great, doesn't it? Guess what they got to? 16%. 16% when they started, 16% when they left office 4 years later. Addicted to announcements, hopeless at delivery. They promised 100 dams, they delivered 2. They promised 22 different energy policies, they didn't land a single one of those. They promised to deliver the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, then they spent 9 years sabotaging it. They promised 450 gigalitres of additional environmental water. They delivered 2. They promised an anti-corruption commission. They spent 1,200 days without delivering it. And they promised a budget surplus and left us with $1 trillion worth of debt. Promises not worth the mug they were printed on. Mr. Speaker, in contrast, we are investing $250 million in recycling facilities, including $60 million in particular for soft plastics and other hard-to-recycle plastics. The members for Moreton, for Bean, for Bruce, for Solomon have all been out and had a look at the great new facilities in their electorates. 48 plastics recycling facilities, 11 already delivered. But it's not just that recycling modernisation fund. $100 million in the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to invest in new technologies like the enzyme technologies that can recycle plastics infinitely. And the $3 billion in the National Reconstruction Fund, the $3 billion out of the $15 billion that the Minister for Industry and Science wants to invest in new industries, for clean energy, for green metals, for remanufacturing, reducing waste in the first place and reducing pollution at the same time. We're reforming packaging laws. We've agreed with state environment ministers to reform our packaging laws by 2025. We're regulating in areas like solar panels and mattresses and electronic goods. They knew that these were a problem, did nothing to regulate to fix the problem. We're bringing together the big supermarkets to really deliver on soft plastics recycling once again to start the collections.
Time has concluded. Give the call to the Prime Minister. Order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's almost 3:30. They're just teasing him, Mr. Speaker. They're just teasing him. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.